I would love to introduce our two for tonight. I'm going to start with Grace Tiffany, our guest of honor tonight. She's an American writer and Shakespeare scholar. She has edited Shakespeare's The Tempest and written articles and nonfiction books about Renaissance literature, as well as 7 novels. Her first fictional work, My Father Had a Daughter, appeared on the BookSense 76 Independent Bookstores Best Books list of 2003. Her 4th novel, Ariel, was listed as a best book by the National Library Association in 2006, and Tiffany's newest novel, which we're going to be speaking about and hearing about tonight, is The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter. It's a sequel to her first. It explores the painful fracturing of a famous family caught up in the political and religious struggles of the English Civil War. And tonight's moderator is Robert Matz, an associate professor of English at George Mason in Fairfax.
Professor. I worked hard for that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was an English major. I should know these things. So a professor at George Mason in Fairfax. I hope that drive wasn't horrendous tonight, but it probably was. He has published essays on Shakespeare and on Renaissance poetry and poetic theory, as well as 2 books, Defending Literature in Early Modern England, Renaissance Literary Theory in Social Context. My son Sam is here tonight, and he has an English final tomorrow, and I told him he was allowed to stay because he's in the right realm. And The World of Shakespeare's Sonnets, an Introduction, which was selected as a 2008 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Robert has served from 2019 to 2024 as the Dean of George Mason University's campus in Korea. Matz teaches courses on 16th and 17th century English literature and on Renaissance drama, including Shakespeare. Thank you both so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here talking to Grace. And I'd like to start by asking you what prompted you to take up the story of Judith Shakespeare again, in moving on in years, and also to set this one in the English Civil War.
Well, even though you told me that you were going to ask me that, I still have to remember why I did either of those things. But I always, I know that I wanted to continue the story of Shakespeare's daughter, which I had begun in the first novel that I wrote, and it ended when she was about 31 years old. And she had a really extraordinary lifespan. Can people hear me in the back? She lived, it wasn't so much the age she lived to be 77, which was a pretty ripe old age for the 17th century, but the times that she lived through, because she was born during the reign of Queen Elizabeth in the late 16th century. She lived through the reign of both Stuart monarchs, for the first 2. She lived through the reign of King James and King Charles, and through the interregnum, the time between kings when the English Civil War was being fought, and then on into the first couple of years of the Restoration. And so that just seemed like a fascinating time period and not knowing very much about this actual historical figure, what she thought. We don't have journals from her or anything like that. It seemed like she seemed like a good person, partly because she had this famous father, which was interesting, but also that she lived through this extremely interesting time in English history to sort of set her in motion during an interesting part of that time, and see what I could make up for her to do. And as for the English Civil War, to set it during that time period, that just seemed like the most dramatic of the changes that she probably lived through. She would have been in her early 60s. The novel is set in 1646, so it's right in the middle of when this war was being fought between the armies of Parliament, which was controlled by zealous radical Protestants, Puritans, and those who were loyal to King James I, the Royalists. And they had their own army, and the country was being ripped up and torn apart, and families were divided, and sons were dying, and brothers were dying. And my character, based on the real person, but I made up a lot of things about her. In my story, she's a surgeon, an apothecary, and a midwife, and she's called into service in ways that she would rather not be called into service, doing battlefield surgeries and amputations, things like that. It seemed like an exciting time in English history that it must have been exciting for her wherever she was, but I put her in particularly dramatic situations in my story. So it just seemed like a very likely backdrop for the story of this person that I wanted to continue, because she lived so much longer. She had so much more to live at the end of the first novel that she starred.
Great. And I'd like to invite you to read a passage where you introduce her.
Okay.
And then maybe talk a little bit about, yes, she lives through this amazing time period, but is also Shakespeare's daughter.
Yeah.
And how you imagine that. Please read the passage.
Okay, so I never know how much context to give, but I'll just a little bit. She's married to a man named Quiney, and she actually was married to a man named Quiney, and they're living in Stratford. And she begins in this chapter, she's talking about her marriage, and she's mad at her husband because she caught him visiting the grave of a former girlfriend. So that's referred to here. But
and this part is true. I mean, the former girlfriend is.
The former girlfriend part is true. And maybe he visited her. We don't know that it's not true.
Let's stipulate that he did.
Yeah, let's assume he did, and that she caught him doing it. So this is chapter 3. Were we dry kindling, awaiting the spark? The wrong metaphor, perhaps, but I struggle for the right one. Once, fleeing through the scullery to evade a cuff from Quiney, my eldest toppled a flask of vinegar into a bowl of yeast, and the powder bubbled and climbed like the eruptions of Mount Etna. That yeast had become something else. In the moment, my son's condition changed with it, as he and even Quiney stopped in their tracks to watch and wonder, forgetting their mischief and wrath. Catalysis was Dr. Hall's word for this altering of elements, though some might call it alchemy. What began our catalysis? Quiney's and mine. Perhaps it was our bitter spat about the blossoms he'd left to grace Margaret Wheeler's bones. Or perhaps the change began a week later, the day Jane and the Pearl first crossed our doorstep. On that morning, I woke frowningly, having dreamt I was back in the graveyard, on my knees this time, praying to a man who sat on a tuft of grass with his back toward me. The fellow's mossy hair just brushed his collar. On his domish head sat a tin crown, and in his hand was a busy quill that scratched and scratched over the surface of a flat stone that lay before him. I thought him a man of power, an arbiter of fortunes. Aloud, I begged him to give me my children back, to bring them up from the earth. I begged he would let me open my eyes and realize their plague deaths had been the simple nightmare that in waking life they still seemed. Without churning, this bald, tin-crowned god stretched out his hand. "Look there," he said, in a familiar, reedy voice, pointing with his quill at a statue. "Look for the thing that was lost." I looked, and suddenly the churchyard monument was Rich, my youngest, smiling and walking toward me. But as I stretched my arms out to him, brimful of joy, I suddenly saw the sham. The walking statue wasn't my own Rich, but Richard Burbage, the famous London tragedian of my father's company, tricked up with a wig and face paint. There I stood, empty-handed and blinking like a fool, mocked with art. I woke on the instant, hollow and desolate, and somehow angry at my quill-wielding father, though I knew my wrath to be unjustified. He wasn't, after all, in charge of real deaths. And as for resurrection, he'd always done the best he could with the tools at hand. He couldn't rightly be blamed for the inadequacies of pen and stage. I guess I should have mentioned that she had lost her children to plague, but that kind of comes through in the passage.
Thank you. I really love that passage, and one of the things is to just think about what strengths you imagined her getting from Shakespeare, what disposition, and maybe what she doesn't get, or what is lost, what art can't do for her. So how did you think about what you not only creating a character, but a character who is the daughter of a great playwright?
Well, what she gets from him is an appreciation of imagination. That's one thing that serves her up to a certain point. And she is a character that was introduced in an earlier novel in which she had a really strained and difficult relationship with her father, where she blames him for never being there. He's always off in London writing plays, and she loses her brother, her twin brother, and somehow her coming to terms with that grief involves her masquerading as her brother, pretending to be him, sneaking onto the London stage, playing a part, and somehow she comes to understand that her father is using plays to figure out things about his family and to express his own grief. And so she's had that resolution in the past, and that was explored in the earlier book. And so she hasn't lost that, but now she has this new grief of having lost her children, and her father's not there, and art can't fix it. So she's just desolate. It's got a very depressing beginning, but I mean it does get better as the story goes on. She's just in a place of desolation, having lost these sons. But there's another way in which you're asking how she's affected by being, what difference does it make that she's Shakespeare's daughter? And I think in a kind of larger way, in the times that she's living through, these revolutionary times where she's trying very hard to be neutral, she doesn't like the bloodshed, she's a healer, she doesn't know which side she sympathizes with, but one thing she doesn't like is the puritanical temper of the land. The Puritans were basically, the Puritan Parliament, basically winning the war, and they were cultural reformers, and they weren't big fans of poetry, and they weren't big fans of stage plays. They shut down the theaters. They were intolerant of a lot of imaginative work that wasn't Bible-based, and so she finds there's one part of the book in which she sees one of her neighbors burning a folio of her father's works, and he kind of shamefacedly says, well, there's witches in it, and there's supernatural stuff going on, and she just calls him an idiot and walks on, because she has an appreciation for works of the imagination in an age when a lot of her neighbors are calling these things diabolical, that pagan poetry and representation of supernatural things on the stage, or leading the country into sin and licentiousness. This is too long an answer, but I want to mention that the one of the characters is a child, because she connects with a young woman, and it's her maidservant, and they end up traveling around the country with a young child who is the maidservant's niece. And the niece is a really crazy, weird little girl who does just strange things, and she's always imitating the barking of dogs, pretending she's an animal, rolling around on the floor. And the townspeople, and even Judith's husband, Shakespeare's daughter's husband, they kind of go like that. Well, they don't go like that because they're good Puritans, so they don't make the sign of the cross. But they think that this is deviltry. They're inclined to think that this young girl is possessed. And so at one point she has an argument with her husband where he kind of half jokingly calls her a spawn of Satan or something like that. And she says, I just call that imagination. Exactly. And so I think that that's the main connection between her and her father, is that she loves and appreciates stories and imagination.
Yeah. And in that passage also transformation, which is imagination drives.
Yeah, becoming another person through the use of your imagination, or an animal, as it may be.
And then, one of the things people admire about Shakespeare is that it's often hard to tell where his sympathies lie, like in the history plays. And so I wonder if you could introduce your next character by thinking about that too, because on the one hand, your Judith does not like the Puritans very much, but you're really the next main character in the book is a Puritan woman who Judith Shakespeare befriends. So you're trying to kind of see the whole picture as well. Or could you talk a little bit about the decision to write Jane, who is this Puritan? And maybe read.
Do you want me to read?
Yeah,
I'll read the passage first. So this is where, so she gets involved with this young woman who starts as her maidservant, but then things happen that make them have to flee out of town, and the three of them are on the road. They end up sharing lodgings in London. So this young woman named Jane, who is a zealous Puritan, a great supporter of Cromwell's New Model Army. She has brothers who have died on the battlefield and in a holy cause as she sees it, and she's quoting scripture all the time. But she's just she's vibrant, she's this vibrant person, and Judith doesn't necessarily agree with her, but they have interesting conversations. So this is one of their conversations. So Judith is speaking. Jane, will you never marry and have children of your own? I glanced at her shadowed profile. Your sister had a sweetheart, you said. What of you? Have you never loved a man? I have not, except in holy love. Do you not want a man to fall in love with you? To fall in with me? I smiled. Clever. You're a fine young woman, Janie. I paused. In the candle flame, I could not fully read her expression, though I could see that the muscles of her face were set and hard. She said, man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. I'll not argue with that, I said with a laugh. But I added, as softly as I could, we are all born unto trouble, man and woman alike. Yet, even if you are no virgin by some accident, that's no barrier. A good man won't care. She flattened her hands on the table, like mine. She said, the flesh is as the grass. Aye, but even grass has its day and its uses. To my mind's eye came a brief vision of myself and Quiney in the days of our courtship. We almost as young then as Jane was now, lollygagging in the fields outside Stratford, him holding my bonnet and laughing, and me chasing him, also laughing, and tackling him at the last. The thing that was lost. I shook my head and went on. I've seen how you care for Pearl. You'd make a good wife and mother, Jane. She folded her hands as though praying. I have not yet been all I may be. I leaned over and kissed her cheek. We know what we are, but know not what we may be. She looked at me narrowly. Not scripture, is it? Nay, 'tis from another one of those plays of your father's. Ah, so you know of him. She nodded. From Hannah. She heard stories, how your father would write in the middle of a ring of open books, and jump up to run first to this, then over to that, to read something quick, like the hands of a crazy clock. This surprised me. The simile had been mine, and one I was proud of, but it was a mystery how Jane's sister could have heard it. I didn't remember sharing it with anyone at New Place, not John Hall or Susanna or Elizabeth, and I certainly wouldn't have wasted my wit on Master Nash. Him I avoided. Jane toyed with her pencil. I have heard that your father wrote a play of a man who lost his crown for pretending to be a god. I smiled. I know which you mean, Richard II. Perhaps you'd have liked that one. I would. What else did he say, your father? What else? He said everything in the world. Jane shook her head impatiently. Nay, about not knowing what we might be. What was the rest of that saying? I thought. Well, the greater part of it's nonsense. It's the speech of a mad girl in a tragedy. She says, the owl was a baker's daughter. I laughed. But in faith, that's you, Jane. Not an owl. Not a wise owl. Any wisdom of mine comes from Scripture, and I am not mad. No, I said firmly. You are odd, but you are sane. You'll not love. Perhaps in the time of peace. I smiled. The millennium? Scoff not. There are victories to be won in this land before a woman can live in peace in her own house, before a man can. This was true enough. More than half the young matrons of Stratford were doing the work of a husband as well as a wife, while their men tramped about the countryside in their breastplates and axe-edged helmets, or else the matrons were widows. But peace must come soon, I said. The Parliament's all but won the war. The king's trapped like a rabbit. He'll have to submit to their terms. It felt a little deceitful to say so after the hopes Nathan had shared with me. Nate's plot was sheer lunacy, of course. I didn't think Charles could sneak out of Oxford. But still, if the whole Scots army and a body of London Presbyterians were indeed inclined toward a separate negotiation with the king, heedless of Cromwell, there was a chance, one way or another, that he'd be back on his throne in Whitehall before the year was out. This despite all the hopes of Jane and her radical ilk. The king is a tyrant, said Jane. He has tried to rule England without England, to make the Parliament go away. Well, aye, he has. He is an idol. He must not be put back in the basilica. Then where must he go, my night owl? To France, to join his queen and his son. Let him revel there, or let him repent and be a private English citizen. Let him humble himself to join our community of saints. I shook my head. Can you not see this is impossible? Even Parliament does not envision his abdication. Not even most of the independents. They say Cromwell himself argues for the king's reinstatement, only under the terms of law. Jane nodded. General Cromwell is right about the law. Charles Stuart must bow to the will of the people, their will made law. He must confess God's people sovereign. I thought of King Charles Stuart, proudly horsed in his portraits, and of Nathan, feigning to be the monarch, mounted on an imaginary steed, his fist on his hip, a regal look on his face. He won't, I said.
Thank you.
I hope that was the part you had in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And so 2 questions. One is, did you enjoy, or what was it like trying to write that alternative point of view, which is in some ways a quite sympathetic view, the view of the Puritan? And the second question is, so the line about we know not what we will become, the owl was a baker's daughter, is the title of your book. Why that title? Why that particular quotation?
Well, the Puritan point of view isn't actually alternative to my point of view, because I kind of think they were right in this war. And not that I agree with all their aesthetic or moral judgments, but it was a political war in which they were trying to curb the power of a rogue sovereign who was trying to bypass their will, and he suspended Parliament and was trying to tax people directly and just kind of do whatever he wanted because he was the king. And the Parliament, whatever their religious objectives, you know, as we know, they wanted church reforms and they wanted social reforms that I don't necessarily agree with, but their political reforms, I think that was pretty easy, you know, to make her, to have her voice that protest, that, you know, there is a Parliament, a large part of it is elected by the people, they have certain rights, you can't trample on them. And I think Puritans get a bad rap a lot as sort of buzzkill people, you know, killjoys, but I think that part should be represented, is that they were really political reformers. They were the radical, well, they were, I don't want to call them radicals, because they were standing for a time-honored privilege, and the king was really was out of bounds, and they were very important to the inspiration of the American Revolution a century later. So no, I can't remember what your second question was.
Oh, about the title. And,
the title.
And how that particular line from Ophelia resonates with you.
Yeah, it's hard to remember what I thought. I wanted to make this character of Jane, this Puritan, zealous character. She's actually more fun than she sounded like in that little passage.
Yeah, she's actually very smart.
Great, yeah.
And she does some wild things, but I thought it would make sense for her to be a baker's daughter. She's this kind of working class woman, and but I think it was mostly the second part of it's something that Ophelia says in Hamlet as she's mad and she babbles this kind of obscure nonsense and sing some little songs. But one of the things she says is, Lord, we know what we are, but know not what we may be. And it's just a beautiful life. I mean, I don't know what she thinks when she's saying it, but it's, you know, it's just full of possibility that you could be anything. And it seemed to fit in different ways with first the theater and the characters in the story who come out of that acting tradition and live to take on this role or that role and try it out and just like be that person. So we have this one character who actually tries to come off the stage and play a political part that is kind of wild and crazy, but also that the women in the story they're pushing envelopes, they're going off to London together, they're making a living. Judith gets along without her husband for a while, and the character of Jane herself does something not unheard of for a woman by the end of the story, but something very audacious by playing a role that's not stereotypically feminine. And so, you know, she knows what she is, but she hasn't tested the limits of what she can be. And then at the end, there's a kind of, I hope, a sort of prediction that the world that the young girl will inherit will have further possibilities for women too. They could write plays, they could publish books, you know, things like that.
Thank you. So this idea of transformation and becoming something different, and that being partly a theatrical experience of becoming something different, is also an introduction to your third main character, who is an actor who actually acted some of Shakespeare's plays, Nathan Field. Do you want to read the passage about Nathan, and then we can talk a little bit about him?
Yeah, this is a kind of short one. I'm going to find it here. And so he's also a real historical figure. I made up most of what he does, but he was a boy actor in Shakespeare's company, and he is a character in the earlier novel who Judith re-encounters and when she comes back to London. And he has, as you might have inferred from the last passage, he's involved himself in a plot to help the king King Charles I escape from Oxford, where he's besieged by Cromwell's army. And believe it or not, this part is actually true, that not Nathan Field's part in it, but there was a plot that partly succeeded for King Charles to disguise himself and escape from Oxford that way. So I brought that into the story. So at this part of the story, Judith and her two female companions have fallen in with this guy, Nathan, and they're heading north again. And Nathan is trying to involve Judith in the plot, and Judith is kind of, you know, trying to stay out of it. Judith is an apothecary, she's a surgeon, she's a midwife. Nathan has decided to disguise himself as a surgeon. I don't know if there was any reason for that. I can't remember, but it's just something that he would do. So he decides he's going to pretend to. Well, he's like, okay, I'll be a surgeon for the ride north. So, okay, so they're on the road. The roads were choked with soldiers and folk fleeing northwest, and blocked by even more sentries than we'd met on our journey south the month before. So we made slow progress. I wondered how a king in disguise could ever hope to make his way through the many stops and questionings that would be imposed on him, even if he got out of Oxford. Nate's plot seemed more lunatic every hour. But I didn't share my thoughts with Nathan for fear of being overheard by fellow travelers. Our first meeting with a soldier's roadblock increased my worry, not for the king, but for Nate. His papers caused no comment. It was his manner that raised eyebrows. When a red-bearded parliament man looked at our documents and asked who awaited our ministrations in Abingdon, Nathan was ready with the plausible-sounding common surname we'd finally agreed on. But he couldn't leave well alone. He then must wax apothetical, speaking a mix of Dr. Caius and old healer Saruman about the green box of simples he kept in his closet, and how he'd a powder that might the fire of life rekindle in a corpse, not dead 5 hours, until I thought he'd be arrested for blasphemy or sorcery or both. Pressed though the private was, with the stream of riding and walking travelers, he looked as though he might call over his sergeant to speak further with Nathan. But I intervened, saying Milady so-and-so's time was near, and the doctor was wise, but we'd best on to Abingdon, or our journey would be entirely wasted. We aimed to be at her house before the waters broke. Puzzled, the young man looked at the sky. I see no clouds. The waters. I gestured meaningfully toward my abdomen. The man looked alarmed, and in a trice we were through. Ninny, I hissed to Nathan, once we were well past the garrison. You doctor it well for the comic stage. Is this how you were caught before? I did not say I was caught before. I said I almost was. Nathan, they spoke truly of you who called you a second Burbage. You are the best player I have ever seen on a stage. Ah, you said it. You said it. But you're accustomed to playing for folk who know you're playing. I slapped away the finger he was waving in my face. Try to recall that you don't want to be admired for how well you're doing it. I reckon you think you could play it better. I'm not playing it. I am it. I don't trot out prescriptions in blank verse. Most of the time I say nothing at all. Let's have this be one of those times. Well, very well. I spurred my mare and rode ahead, gritting my teeth. How marvelous if Nathan's playing skills were the thing that got us all thrown into the clink as forgers. Could he even understand what it was to do and not pretend to do? The times when I was most a doctor were the times when I thought least about being one. That meant simply performing the job of it, stitching a wound, measuring a powder, calming a patient, sawing a bone if I had to. I said as much to Nathan a half hour later when I'd cooled down and we'd stopped by a brook for a drink. God knows you'd not want me trying any of those things. He mopped his face with his cap, then put it back on his head and straightened it fussily with his fingertips. I'm only trying to look the part. But this is just what I mean. On the stage thou dost look the part, but on these roads I fear for thee. Truly to look the part, thou'dst keep thy mouth shut, or speak of the weather. Ah, Judy, he pinched my cheek fondly. You are theeing and thouing. You love me still.
So he's like a really comic, kind of anarchic character to some degree.
You compared him to Falstaff.
Right. But he also, in some ways, he's the most extravagant embodiment of this idea of theatricality.
Yeah.
This idea that all the world's a stage, that we all play roles, that politicians play roles. So maybe you could talk, and he's a great, you can use this on your final, a foil, for, a foil for Jane, because there's the very serious and the very comic one. So maybe you could talk a little bit about his idea of theatricality, which, has the kind of Falstaffian, maybe it's too much.
The interesting thing is that he actually was the son of, and this is the real character, the real person, was the son of a famous Puritan pastor, a zealous Puritan pastor. And so we can only assume that his pastor would, his father would not have approved of his line of work. As a young boy, he ran away and became an apprentice and became a really successful player, and then a playwright and an adult actor. And so I kind of like that idea that he really is the opposite. Like Jane comes, or at least has embraced, the world that was his father's, and he knows it very well. But it's restrictive, and it's men are men and women are women, and men aren't supposed to dress up like girls on the stage, and he fled from all that. And at least as I imagine him, the psychology is, you can't tell me what to be, I can be anything. And choosing playing as a profession it is anarchic, but it's his way of asserting a kind of absolute liberty to try this or try that, or play this role, play that role, be whatever he feels like he might be. But he's also kind of centerless, because he doesn't have a self apart from that. I hope he's an entertaining character, but it's all a game to him. And so Jane kind of objects to that, and thinks it's falseness, and Judith is kind of caught in the middle. And so I'm not sure, like, if you're asking what's the right attitude to have towards stage play.
More than I think that the book is an interesting reflection on both the liberating powers of theater, and then the kind of excess skepticism, or the limits. I mean, it's in the first passage too. You can pretend to bring people back to life, but you really can't.
Right.
And so there's some limits that Jane respects in a way that Nathan does not.
Well, and I think there are two ways that it works. As in Shakespeare, he's so fascinated with the idea of stage play and with writing plays about playing parts. Mm-hmm. But you can see these different points of view in there, that on the one hand, pretending to be a thing you're not is a way to become that thing, and to liberate yourself into, his plays are full of girls who dress up as boys so they can actually be who they really are, because then they can go out in the world and tell other people what to do. And so playing can have that authentic aspect to it, be truly self-expressive. But then other times it's deception, and it's a way of masking and hiding either as something that's opposite to the thing being represented, or a kind of emptiness. And that can happen too, right? That's the dark side of playing. And the way the theme, what interested me most in theater as a theme in this play, I mean, partly you have the first kind, the playing as self-expression, I think mostly through the character of Jane, who, I don't want to say what happens, but through finally playing a role and taking on a false identity, she gets to kind of like become this, almost like a goddess or something. Mm-hmm. She really realizes all her zealous, ambition. But then you have this idea of King Charles, who is playing the role of a god, and he's just a human being, and he needs to be taught to be a human being and to confine himself within the limits of law. And the idea is expressed, by Jane, that he's just kind of playing this theatrical role with all his pomp and his orb and his scepter and his crown, and that there's something idolatrous about believing in it and supporting it, that he needs to understand that he's a regular man. And you can find that idea all over the place in Shakespeare's plays of kings also. So I think, both of those things are in there.
So
both of those ways of looking at theater.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this book reads like a book written by someone who's been steeped in Shakespeare, because
I guess that's good.
Yeah, it is.
I can't be Shakespeare, but I can quote him here or there.
Yeah, well, but particularly, as we were saying, Shakespeare's plays are very self-reflexive about theater as an aspect of our real lives, and that is very much the case through many plots and many conversations in this book, which is one of the things that really interested me about it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that I'm glad that you asked about that, because that is the theme that interested me the most, but also the part that was the hardest to describe in writing. And there is a part where the plot that Nathan is involved in involves him switching identities with the king. So the real part, the true part of the story, and I won't tell like everything that happens, but the true part of the story is that the king really did escape from Oxford dressed as his manservant. So he had to kind of learn how to fake it as an ordinary citizen in order to get out of Oxford. They caught him in the end, Charles came to a bad end, for those who don't know. They ended up catching him, and it didn't go well for him. But in the story, I took that historical fact, which I thought was really interesting, of this escape plot, and I thought it would be pretty cool if Nathan decided, well, I'll stay in Oxford and I'll play the role of you. You know, like I'll get to be I've played Richard II on stage, now I get to play Charles I for real. And there's a part where Judith comes into a room. She ends up going to Oxford and being part of the early stages of this plot, and she sees the king standing by a window, and she just feels this sense of awe. And she's never thought of herself as much of a royalist, and she's very neutral, but she just feels she wants to sink on her knees, and she worships, just feels this sense of worshipfulness. He's the King of England, and he's got his scepter in hand, and I can't remember, but anyway, he just looks royal as he's sitting there. He turns around, and she begins to talk to him, and all of a sudden she realizes it's Nathan in his costume, and she has a kind of epiphany where she realizes it is just a sham. It is like it's all just a trick. It's a stage trick. Royalty is a stage trick, and so she has this kind of political awakening, and begins to see things more from Jane's point of view. But I won't say what happens after that because there's some spoilers in it. But that was the hardest part to write. That's what I wanted to say, is just to try and describe the realization that she has there, and to somehow describe, you know, that she understands that politics is a kind of theater, and gets it at a real emotional level, and then begins to want to reject it for this kind of political theater.
Thank you.
I don't know what should we have? Yeah, I didn't know how much.
Should we open it up
if
to
there's
other
any
people's questions? Is it a good time
Yeah.
to do that?
Yeah, I think so. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, one, did you, I don't know if I don't remember if you said if your character of Judith was like really well versed in the plays, in Shakespeare's plays, but did you like go back to the plays a lot when you were writing it to like, for whatever reason?
Yeah, I did, but I teach Shakespeare, so I just it's part. I get immersed in the semester by semester. I did actually. There were particular parts that I wanted to go back to. That, you know, Richard II was a play that was kind of important to this story, so I had to go back but I've been teaching Shakespeare for so many years, and that's something that really, really helps me with the dialogue, because it starts to sink into your brain after a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good question.
I was also wondering the what you were just saying about the king being the political theatricalness of all of it all. It's what about like the difference between, I've heard it said as like big K king and small K king, like the big capital K, like king, the position of king, and then the small K, individual person. Was that? I think my view is that the capital K is just when it's attached to somebody's name, like a formal title, and then you talk about the king, then like the proper Associated Press style or whatever it is, you put the small K in front of it. But I think in a larger way that the history of England is moving the king from being a capital K king to a smaller and smaller K as they go along. So in a kind of philosophical way. Other questions?
Well, if not, go ahead.
I was just, so early on you said something about Judith in her role as, in this role she's not serving as a midwife but as a surgeon and as a medic of sorts on the battlefield. And as I was reading it, I really had the sense that she was in her element, that this was freedom for her in a way, that she didn't experience at home with Quiney, and the loss of her children. And I was kind of surprised that she went back, actually. I mean, having experienced that freedom, and I'm curious, and also this idea that the imagination that you talked about in the beginning, she was also considered a witch. Like, the Puritans did not view her positively. You know, she was on the cutting edge of some medicines that have since unfolded, and yours and a number of other books that have come out in the past 18 months or whatever about midwives and medicines that were developed, not sort of like, you know, antibiotics, but medicines that women midwives used. These were powerful ways for women to really step into their world and be acknowledged. And I'm just curious, I didn't read your predecessor book, so I don't know when she starts to do this, but her progression as a woman and as an independent woman, I'm curious what you thought about her.
Yeah, the thing about the threatened witchcraft charge is that's the reason that she has to leave town and that she ends up in London. And there had been people being accused of witchcraft for a long time in England, so it wasn't just a puritanical, you know, phenomenon. But usually it was women, and usually older women, as she now is, who practice, you know, cunning women who practiced herbal arts, and there probably were some real witches too, you know, but or people who thought they were, but yeah, it seemed, honestly, I have to say that was a good way to get her out of town, because I needed to get her on the road so that other things could happen. But you're right that the 17th century was an interesting time when you still had people being accused of witchcraft, but you have Isaac Newton, you know, figuring out the laws of gravity and the beginnings of the Enlightenment, and people being kind of skeptical about these non-natural explanations for things. And you have lots of people who are condemning witchcraft accusations at the same time some were making them. And we have our own weird history with witchcraft accusations. But what a lot of people don't know about the Salem witch trials is that the accusers repented later and said, we were crazy. I don't know what we were thinking. So it was a time when Enlightenment thinking was taking hold, and people were finding more kind of practical explanations for things. And so I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, but you're right that it is this kind of watershed time in history, and women were often the victims of these sorts of suspicions, and but she manages to get away with it. she manages not to get. They weren't burning them anymore; they were hanging them, but she manages to escape.
But in the one instance that they talk about, the baby lives.
Yeah.
And
True.
so they recant. The mother is so
She lives
you know.
because of this scary potion, you know, that was really just an herb or you know. But well, I didn't want to kill Judith off, because you know I didn't want a tragic end to the book, but she does manage to. The town comes to its senses on that score.
You did bring up something that I thought was so interesting that I hadn't considered, so you said it, and the whole idea of being in her element while they were at war, and the idea that you were surprised she went back, and that didn't dawn on me until you said it. And can you elaborate a little bit on that and that character and why she went back? Because there was that moment, you know, when she left and was trying to decide what to do. Like, she ran out of the house. She's trying. Do I go follow?
She has an opportunity to run away with this roguish player.
And in that moment, or do I go back? And she opted to find Jane. You know.
So do you think she should have run off with Nathan?
No.
But she does find out that her husband sent the guy. Yeah. And that, I think, makes a lot, I mean, that changes.
Together.
You won't remember that.
Yeah.
By the way.
The story is about grief. Everybody, all of your characters are grieving the
Yeah,
loss of
I mean,
something.
part of her, she's in this profound,
Right.
you know, desolation with her husband, and part of the reason they can't stand each other,
It's the
well,
grief.
that's too strong, but they're having trouble living together because of their grief, and they have no children left, and so she has to come to terms with that, but it's not, I mean, I have her go back because she's married to him, you know, and
She
she's,
also breaks through some of her grief by her escapade. I mean,
that's what I
felt like she
Yes.
rekindled by seeing Nate. She got to remember what she was like before everything happened to her. in her
I'm
life.
glad that came through, because I feel like I can't say that worked, that came through. As the author, I have no idea
To me
whether
did.
it makes sense
So
at
she
the end.
came back to
you
me
know,
because she
but that's
needed
what I.
something to punch a hole in her grief, and
Okay.
her
Well, I'm
this did.
okay.
So.
So you know better than I whether it makes sense. Someone had a hand. I don't know how much time. Someone had a hand. Yeah.
I have a soft spot for Quiney.
Yeah.
He's like the non-Shakespeare character. He's so inarticulate. Like he's surrounded with all these like. You know, Judith has this great internal monologue going with allusions to Shakespeare, and Quiney's just, I am grief. My children are dead, and and I'm just stomping through my life. So like I can see why she would want to run away from him. Like you said, his grief and her grief are just kind of radiating at each other. But I think you're right. Whoever said there's a sense of freedom on the road, but I'm kind of glad she went back because it was trying.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't a story of running away from an abusive husband. So you shouldn't go back. Quiney wasn't. I didn't really think.
No, he's a good man. He's a son.
Yeah.
He's a mensch.
He's just really, really sad.
Anyone else? Well, thank you guys for coming on this horrible.